Emily had always believed that quiet afternoons were the safest moments, the kind where nothing surprising could happen, but that belief shattered the instant she stepped into Mark's home that Saturday, carrying a warm plate of cookies for his mother, Linda, who had recently moved in after a small knee injury. Emily had known Mark for years, long enough to trust the calmness of his home, long enough to think nothing dramatic ever happened here. But she was wrong, and the moment she crossed the living room, the house proved it with a single loud shout that traveled through the hallway like an earthquake. "Son, why is your dog touching me in there? Don't stop, keep going, it feels so good." Emily froze, her hands trembling so hard the cookies nearly slipped out of her grasp. Her chest tightened as her mind tried to understand what she had just heard, because the words didn't sound innocent, they didn't sound normal, and they definitely didn't sound like something a mother should shout. In a house where visitors stood only a few feet away, Mark shot up from the couch as if a fire had ignited under him, staring at Emily with wide eyes full of shock and confusion. "What did she just say?" he whispered, though the question didn't need an answer, because they both heard it perfectly, and there was no mistaking the strange, unsettling tone. Before Emily could respond, Mark rushed down the hallway, nearly tripping over Bruno, the golden retriever who barked excitedly at all the sudden movement. Emily followed close behind, her breath quick and uneven, her mind racing with the worst possible thoughts even though she knew Linda wasn't that kind of woman. Linda was sweet, gentle, a little dramatic at times, but certainly not someone who would shout something so strange without a reason. Still, Emily's heart pounded painfully, because sometimes a misunderstanding could open doors to thoughts no one wanted to admit they had. Mark reached the guest room first, stopping in front of the half-open door. "Mom," he said loudly. "What is going on?" Emily stood beside him, afraid to look, afraid not to look, but then they stepped inside, and the truth hit them so quickly they both let out breaths they didn't realize they'd been holding. Linda sat on the carpeted floor with her legs tucked to the side, smiling brightly as Bruno shoved his nose into a large cardboard box filled with old yarn buttons and unfinished knitting projects. "Oh, you two scared me," Linda laughed, brushing hair from her forehead. "Bruno is helping me find my knitting needles, his nose is amazing. I kept telling him not to stop sniffing because it feels so good to finally get this mess organized." Mark closed his eyes in relief, and Emily pressed a hand to her chest, feeling her heartbeat slow as the panic melted into embarrassed laughter. Bruno barked again, proud of himself as he nudged a metal knitting needle out of the box and onto Linda's lap. "See," Linda said proudly. "He's very helpful." Emily laughed nervously, though inside she still felt shaken, not because of Linda, but because of the wave of emotions that had crashed through her at the thought of something terrible happening, and even more confusing, why her first instinct had been to protect Mark. Mark helped his mother stand, gently guiding her to the guest bed. "Mom, please choose your words more carefully." Emily nearly fainted, he said, shooting a quick glance at Emily. "And you," Linda smirked. "Looked like you were running to put out a fire." Mark flushed, rubbing the back of his neck, but Emily didn't miss the way he kept glancing at her, as if checking whether she was truly all right, and that tiny detail made her heart stir in a way she didn't expect. When the moment calmed, Emily walked back toward the kitchen, carrying the empty cookie plate, but halfway there she paused, leaning against the counter as she whispered to herself, "Why did that scare me so much?" It was a strange reaction, almost too emotional, as if the moment had tapped into something deeper she'd been ignoring for months, feelings she didn't want to name, feelings she had pushed aside each time Mark smiled at her for a second too long, or each time his hand brushed hers when they reached for something at the same time. She inhaled slowly, trying to steady herself, but the truth sat heavy in her chest, and she couldn't run from it anymore. Mark entered the kitchen moments later, carrying 2 mugs of tea. "Sorry about all that," he said softly. "My mom doesn't realize how dramatic she sounds sometimes." Emily gave a small smile. "It's all right, it just surprised me." But her voice sounded too light, too fragile, and Mark noticed, because he always noticed things about her, small things, subtle things, the things most people ignored. He stepped closer, not too close but close enough for her to feel the warmth of him. "Are you sure you're okay?" he asked, concern softening his tone. Emily nodded, though her heartbeat quickened again, because being near him suddenly made the air feel warmer and heavier. "I'm fine," she whispered, just startled. Mark looked at her for a long moment, his eyes gentle, his expression unreadable. "I'm glad it was nothing serious," he said quietly. "I don't like seeing you scared." Those words brushed against something inside her, something soft and unguarded, and she felt her breath catch. She quickly turned away, pretending to adjust something on the counter. But the truth was she needed the distance because the more she stayed close to Mark, the more her feelings threatened to spill over later. When Linda returned to the living room with her reorganized knitting box, Emily joined her, trying to shake off the lingering tension. Linda smiled warmly, patting the seat next to her. "Come here, dear," she said. "I want to show you something." Emily sat beside her, watching as Linda pulled out an old scarf she had started years ago. "I promised myself I would finish this before winter ends," Linda said. "And maybe give it to someone special." Her eyes drifted meaningfully toward Mark, who stood in the hallway listening but pretending not to. Emily felt heat rush to her cheeks. "It's beautiful," she murmured, running her fingers gently over the soft wool. Linda nodded, her smile turning knowing. "Some things take time, dear, but they're worth it when the moment is right." Emily didn't fully understand what Linda meant, but something in her tone felt tender and intentional, almost as if Linda could see something Emily herself was struggling to accept. Before she could ask, Bruno jumped onto the couch, startling both women, sending a burst of laughter through the room, breaking the moment. As the evening settled, Emily tried to push the earlier feelings away, but they kept returning, tugging at her heart each time Mark spoke, each time he passed by her in the hallway, each time their eyes met unexpectedly. And when she finally sat alone near the window, watching the autumn light fade, she whispered again, "Why did I feel jealous earlier?" She didn't have an answer, not yet, but the truth was closer than ever, resting quietly between her and Mark like a secret waiting to be spoken. What she didn't realize, what she couldn't realize, was that the misunderstanding in the hallway was only the beginning, a spark that would ignite everything that had been silent for far too long. And as Mark watched her from across the room, his expression soft, thoughtful, full of emotions he never voiced, the real story was beginning slowly, gently, just waiting for the right moment to unfold. The house felt different after the strange misunderstanding, as if the air carried emotions that no one wanted to name out loud. The evening settled in slowly, covering the living room in warm golden light, and Emily tried her best to keep her thoughts steady, but nothing felt steady, not anymore, because every time she looked at Mark, something inside her shifted. Something gentle but powerful, something she wasn't ready to face. Linda, resting near the fireplace with her knitting bag open beside her, watched Emily with eyes that had seen decades of unspoken feelings. "Emily," she called softly, her voice calm and warm. "Come sit with me for a moment." Emily hesitated for only a second before walking over and taking the seat across from her. She sat straight, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, trying to appear composed. Linda studied her carefully, her smile kind. "You were shaking earlier," she said gently. "Was it only the shock or was something else bothering you?" The question hit Emily harder than she expected because she had been trying to hide everything, especially from Linda, who saw truth the way others saw colors, simply and instantly. "I was just surprised," Emily said quietly. "I didn't expect something like that." Linda chuckled softly, a warm, comforting sound. "You and me both," she said. "But I know when fear comes from surprise, and I know when it comes from emotions we don't want to admit." Emily's throat tightened, her chest filling with pressure she couldn't hide anymore. She looked down at her hands, unable to meet Linda's eyes. "I don't want to complicate anything," she said in a whisper. "Mark and I are close, we've been friends for years, I don't want to ruin that." Linda listened with the patience of someone who had carried love, lost it, rebuilt it, and learned from it. She picked up a piece of yarn and wrapped it slowly around her fingers, thinking before she spoke. "You care about him," Linda said softly. "More than you want to admit." The words felt like a door creaking open inside Emily, letting in light she wasn't prepared for. She took a breath, feeling her heartbeat quicken. "I don't know what to do," she said. "I didn't mean for anything to happen, I never meant to feel this way." Linda leaned forward slightly, her voice low and affectionate. "Love isn't something you plan, dear, it comes quietly, and suddenly, and sometimes at the moment you least expect." Emily swallowed hard, fighting the emotions rising in her chest. Her eyes grew warm, her breath heavy, because the truth she had been hiding was suddenly too close, too real. Before she could say anything more, footsteps sounded behind them, slow, hesitant, almost nervous. Mark stood in the hallway, unseen at first, listening without meaning to. His heart pounded so loudly he could hear it in his ears, because he had not expected to hear his name spoken with that kind of emotion. He leaned against the wall, frozen, trying to breathe quietly, but every word that came from Emily's lips struck him like a wave he wasn't prepared for. He had always seen her as strong, calm, confident, someone who didn't show fear unless something truly shook her. and now he heard the soft trembling in her voice, the vulnerability she rarely allowed anyone to witness. His chest tightened, his hands shaking slightly, because he had felt something for Emily too, something quiet, something strong, something he had forced himself to ignore. He took a slow step forward, ready to enter the room, ready to finally let the words he had buried inside for months come out. But Bruno barked loudly from the kitchen, breaking the quiet moment like a sudden crash of thunder. Emily jumped, wiping at her eyes quickly, and Mark stopped in his tracks, trapped again between wanting to speak and being too stunned by what he had heard. "I should check on him," Emily said quickly, standing up before Linda could say anything. She rushed out of the living room, grateful for the distraction, grateful for an excuse to run from the confession she hadn't meant to start. Mark stepped forward as if to follow her, but Linda raised a hand slightly, stopping him. She looked at him with eyes full of understanding. "You heard her, didn't you?" Linda said softly. Mark exhaled, his shoulders tense. "I didn't mean to listen," he said. "I just heard my name. And then I couldn't move." Linda smiled, the kind of smile that held both pride and sadness. "Love will do that to you," she said gently. Mark ran a hand through his hair, pacing a few steps, trying to gather his thoughts. "I never wanted to risk our friendship," he said. "Emily means too much to me and I didn't want to lose her." Linda leaned back in her chair, her knitting resting in her lap. "You're running out of chances, sweetheart," she said, her voice soft but firm. "You can't keep waiting for the perfect moment because love doesn't wait for perfect." Mark stopped pacing, breathing deeply, his mind racing with every moment he had shared with Emily, every smile, every quiet conversation, every time she had been there without asking for anything in return. "I should talk to her," he murmured. "She deserves honesty." Linda nodded slowly. "She does," she agreed. "And so do you." But even as Mark prepared himself to go find Emily, something in him still shook, because the fear wasn't about losing her friendship anymore. It was about wanting something so deeply he didn't know how to reach for it without breaking the fragile balance between them. Meanwhile, in the kitchen, Emily leaned against the counter, holding Bruno gently by his collar to calm him. But the truth was she was trying to steady herself. She felt exposed, raw, shaken by what she had admitted to Linda, even if she hadn't spoken the full truth out loud. She stared at the floor, whispering to herself, "Why did I let her see so much?" It wasn't only embarrassment, it was fear. The fear that Mark might have heard something, the fear of losing the friendship that had been her anchor for so long, but also the fear that she couldn't hide her heart anymore. She lifted her head slowly as she heard footsteps approaching the kitchen entrance, her breath caught in her throat, because she knew it was Mark before she even saw him, but he didn't come in. He stood outside the doorway for a moment, watching her quietly, fighting the war inside himself. He wanted to speak, to reach her, to tell her what he felt, but the words tangled inside him, refusing to come out without the right moment, and that moment wasn't now, so he turned away before she could see him, leaving Emily unaware of how close he had been to changing everything. As the night settled deeper into the house, the emotions hung between them like threads of a story neither of them knew how to finish. Linda watched the two of them from her place by the fire, her eyes full of gentle hope, because she had lived long enough to recognize the early steps of love, the fear, the longing, the hesitations, the silences. She knew this was only the beginning. A misunderstanding had opened the door, but the truth waiting behind it was much bigger than any of them realized. And when Emily went to bed that night, her heart heavy and tender, she whispered to herself, "I need to distance myself." Even though the thought hurt more than she expected. Across the hall, Mark lay awake staring at the ceiling, whispering into the quiet air, "I can't lose her." They were two hearts beating quietly in separate rooms, both afraid, both longing, both unaware that the next day would bring a moment that neither of them would be able to walk away from. Morning arrived quietly, slipping through the curtains like a soft whisper, filling the house with pale light that touched every corner. Emily stood alone in the kitchen, her fingers wrapped around a warm cup of tea as she tried to steady her thoughts. She had barely slept, tossing through hours of memories and feelings she didn't know how to contain anymore. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Mark's face, the gentle worry in his eyes, the unspoken emotions that hovered between them for far too long. She tried to convince herself that nothing had changed, that last night's confession to Linda was just a small moment, something she could tuck away again. But deep down she knew the truth was too large. Now, feelings didn't disappear when spoken out loud, even whispered by accident. They grew heavier, more real, more impossible to hide. Mark walked into the kitchen quietly, his steps light as if he didn't want to scare the silence away. He paused in the doorway, watching Emily for a moment. The soft morning glow lit her profile, and something in him shifted, something he had been ignoring for too long. He knew he couldn't let the day pass without finally saying what had been sitting in his chest for months. "Emily," he said softly. She turned at the sound of his voice, her breath catching in her throat. She had hoped for a slow morning, a peaceful morning, anything that didn't demand emotional truth. But now, standing there with the sunlight behind him, Mark looked like someone who had already made a decision. "We should talk," he said. Emily nodded slowly, though her heart raced. She set her cup down carefully and faced him, trying to keep her voice steady. "About what?" Mark moved closer, his steps calm but sure, as if he had finally found solid ground after walking through a storm of uncertainty. "About last night," he said. "I heard what you said to my mom." Emily froze. For a moment the room felt too small, the air too tight. She didn't know how to breathe. Her cheeks warmed as she dropped her gaze to the floor. "I didn't mean for you to hear that," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I wasn't trying to make anything difficult." Mark shook his head gently. "It didn't make anything difficult," he said. "It made things clear." Emily blinked, the words hitting her unexpectedly. "Clear?" "Yes," he said quietly. "Because I've been feeling the same way." Her head lifted slowly, her eyes meeting his with disbelief. She had imagined this moment in 100 different ways, always convincing herself it was impossible. But now, hearing it from him, the world felt like it shifted into a place she had never allowed herself to imagine. "Mark," she whispered, her voice thin with emotion. "Why didn't you say anything?" He took another step closer, standing only inches from her now. "Because I didn't want to lose you," he said. "You've been my closest friend for years. I didn't want to risk changing something that already meant so much to me." Emily swallowed, her heartbeat rushing so loud she could barely hear anything else. "I felt the same," she said, her voice fragile. "I was terrified of ruining what we had." For a long moment, they stood there in the quiet kitchen. Two people who had spent years dancing around the truth finally standing face to face with it. The fear that had held them back began to fade, replaced by something calmer, something deeper. Before either of them could speak again, a soft knock came from the hallway entrance. They turned to see Linda leaning against the frame with a playful smile, her knitting bag hanging from her hand. Her eyes sparkled with quiet satisfaction, as if she had always known this moment would come. "I'm sorry to interrupt," she said lightly, "but I think the two of you have waited long enough." Emily felt heat rise to her face, and she laughed nervously, unable to find the right words. Mark rubbed the back of his neck, giving his mother a look that was half embarrassed and half grateful. Linda walked into the kitchen and reached for a teapot on the counter, speaking as she moved. "You know," she said, "life doesn't always give second chances. When something feels right, you shouldn't let fear steal it away." Emily glanced at Mark, her eyes softening. Mark stepped closer again, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "She's right," he whispered. "I don't want to waste any more time pretending I don't feel this." Emily's breath hitched. "Me neither." The confession felt like a weight lifting off her chest, something she had carried far too long. For the first time she felt free to look at him without holding back, free to let her heart show what it had been trying to express in silence. Mark reached for her hand slowly, giving her time to pull away if she needed to. She didn't. Their fingers touched, then intertwined naturally, as if they had always been meant to fit that way. The warmth of his hand wrapped around hers with a softness that made her chest ache. Linda pretended not to watch them, though the gentle smile on her lips made it obvious she was quietly celebrating. She poured tea for all three of them before stepping back, giving them the space she knew they needed. Age had taught her that love grew best when given room to breathe. Emily looked down at their joined hands, the sight of it making her heart swell. "This feels strange," she whispered. "But in a good way." Mark nodded, a small smile tugging at his lips. "It feels right," he said. "Like we should have admitted this a long time ago." The day moved slowly from that moment on, filled with soft glances, tentative touches, and conversations that carried more honesty than they ever allowed themselves before. Emily felt lighter around him, no longer trapped behind the fear that had kept her silent. Mark felt the same, relieved to finally let the affection he'd been hiding slip through his voice, his smile, his gestures. Later that afternoon, they sat on the back porch while the sun dipped behind the rooftops. The air smelled of autumn leaves and cool wind. They talked about everything they had avoided for months, the moments they realized their feelings were changing, the signs they had ignored, the emotions they had tucked into quiet corners of their hearts. Every word brought them closer, every confession weaving their lives together in a way that felt natural, gentle, real. At one point, Emily leaned her head on Mark's shoulder, and he exhaled a breath he didn't know he had been holding. She felt safe like that, resting against him as if she had done it 1,000 times. He wrapped an arm around her, holding her close with a quiet protectiveness that made her chest warm. Bruno ran across the yard chasing a ball, wagging his tail wildly, and Linda watched them from inside the house with tears in her eyes. She wasn't sad. She was simply happy to see her son step into a new chapter, one she hoped would bring him the love and joy he had always deserved. As the sky darkened, Emily whispered softly, "Mark, do you think things will change too much now?" He looked at her gently. "Things will change," he said. "But I think they'll change in the right way. In the way they were always meant to." Emily nodded, feeling the truth of his words settle deep inside her. For the first time in a long time she felt certain, not scared, not doubtful, just certain. When night settled fully, and the porch lights glowed softly around them, Mark took her hand again and whispered, "This time we won't run from it." And Emily, with her heart finally open and steady, whispered back, "No, we won't." The misunderstanding from the day before, the shout, the confusion, the panic, felt like a wild beginning to something gentle and unexpected. But sometimes stories began in strange places, carrying people to moments they never planned for but needed more than they knew. Their story had begun with laughter, fear, and chaos, but it was ending with honesty, warmth, and the soft promise of something beautiful.